For almost 5 years, the Faith in the City series has been convening monthly conversations about educational equity. And we've done so in a church, a Baptist church. Why? Well, why is educational equity a pressing concern for a community of faith, for people of faith? Today, we welcome 4 distinguished, intriguing, if I may say, guests to explore that question. Why is working for just educational opportunities and outcomes for all children an expression of their own religious traditions? Some of you who've seen our flyers and publicity are trying hard to count to 5. We lost one of our expected panelists. The Reverend Dr. Kia Hood Scott is under doctor's orders to stay home today. He assures me she is not severely ill, but is seriously disappointed, not as disappointed as we are to miss her today. I'd like to ask you to give me a few minutes to set the stage, to introduce our guests before inviting them to start the conversation. They are new acquaintances for the most part to us and to each other. So we might do a little fuller introduction than we do sometimes in this series. Rebecca Hewitt-Newson grew up in Virginia, then studied at Elon University and Wake Forest University School of Divinity. Previously a hospital chaplain and children's minister, Rebecca has been the co-pastor at Emmaus Way, a progressive faith community in Durham, North Carolina, for the past 2.5 years. As a pastor at Emmaus Way, Rebecca brings passion for the ways that adults and children learn and grow together as they embrace common joys, ignite imagination, and work alongside each other to build just and loving community. Rebecca is also a dedicated advocate for public education. She currently leads the board of Pastors for North Carolina Children, a nonpartisan advocacy organization whose mission is to mobilize faith leaders to advocate for public schools in North Carolina. Rebecca lives in Raleigh with her husband, Ryan, and 2 children, Atticus and Isaac. They love to play outside, and they enjoy listening to and making music together. Dina Shehata grew up in Advance, North Carolina, and is a member of the Clemens Islamic Center. Dina holds a bachelor's degree from UNC Chapel Hill with majors in global studies and psychology and a minor in Arabic, and a master's degree in international studies from NC State University with a focus on U.S. Middle East relations. Currently, Dina is a technical assistant specialist and diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice coordinator at ANLAR, which is an education management consulting firm. Dina has provided technical assistance and project management internationally and domestically, with experience supporting young students and professionals of diverse backgrounds through various leadership initiatives. Prior to joining ANLAR, Dina worked for IREX, a global development and education organization, where she supported community leaders from across 13 countries in the Middle East and North Africa, creating an alumni network for them to sustain the skills they learned through their various leadership programs and to allow them to be part of a cohort and support network. Prior to her time at IREX, am I pronouncing that correctly? Close enough. Dina worked with the refugee population in the state of North Carolina and was specifically focused on school responsibilities and creating systemic changes in the school systems to allow for an easier transition for students. Dina has been married to Osama Heshen for 3 months. Rabbi Charlie said, Mazel Tov. Alan Sherouse has been the senior pastor of First Baptist Church Greensboro since September 2013, Before coming to First Baptist Greensboro, he served as pastor at Metro Baptist Church in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of Manhattan, his first pastorate, where many of his convictions about church, community ministry, social justice, and advocacy were formed. Alan is a graduate of Palm Beach Atlantic University, of Wake Forest University Divinity School, and of Vanderbilt University. He's married to Jenny Sherouse, and they're the parents of Jack, Della, Warner, and Bee. Alan is passionate about the role communities of faith can play in advancing justice and the common good. As part of this commitment, he devotes time to community and denominational leadership, serving on boards including those of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, Wake Forest University Divinity School, and the Greensboro Faith Leaders Council. In November 2022, Alan was elected to the Guilford County Board of Education, where he serves as the at-large representative for what is the 50th largest school district in the United States. Rabbi Charlie Cytron-Walker became the new rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Winston-Salem on July 1st, 2022. Originally from Lansing, Michigan, Rabbi Charlie graduated from the University of Michigan. He then worked at a civil and human rights organization in Michigan and a community assistance center in Massachusetts before attending Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion at its Jerusalem and Cincinnati campuses. His rabbinical thesis was titled Jewish Service Learning, Integrating Talmud, Torah, and Maasim Tovim. That's Hebrew for good deeds. From 2006 to 22, Rabbi Charlie served at Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas. He developed positive relationships with local school districts and helped organize interfaith gatherings. On January 15th, 2022, Rabbi Charlie and 3 congregants were held hostage by a gunman in the Congregation Beth Israel sanctuary. You will have heard of this incident. After an 11-hour standoff, all the hostages were able to escape when Rabbi Charlie threw a chair at the gunman, distracting him long enough for everyone to get out of the building. Since then, he's spoken out on the importance of security training for religious communities, especially small congregations, as well as the need to bring stronger bridges between faith communities. He's testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary and Homeland Security Committees, has been published in and profiled for a wide range of national news sources. In 2022, he was honored as a hero against hate by the Texoma Anti-Defamation League and currently serves as a special advisor to the Anti-Defamation League. And he is our relatively new neighbor. Rabbi Charlie notes, in conclusion, he remains completely in love with Dina Shehata and simply adores his 2 daughters. We have asked each of our speakers, in the order in which they're seated, to offer a 5 to 8 minute opening reflection following one another. I won't interrupt, and answering 2 general questions. First, speaking to what are 2 or 3 efforts toward educational equity that are most pressing from their perspective right now. And secondly, why is seeking equity in education for all children a priority or commitment, an expression of their faith or religious community or tradition? Then we'll invite them to interact with each other, and we'll invite you to ask questions and to become part of a broader conversation. So be thinking ahead to things you're hearing that you'd like to follow up on. Begin by inviting Rebecca to start us off.
Well, I'll start by saying a word of gratitude to Diane and to Knollwood for the invitation, and also just to say what an honor it is to be in such wonderful company. I'm a little bit nervous to go first because I think you all will have just incredible things to say, but I'm grateful to be here with you. So, all right, it's behind me. So Dan mentioned a little bit about the work that I do. And so I wanted to answer this first question of what's most pressing about educational equity right now by thinking both organizationally as my work as the board president for pastors of North Carolina Children, but then also personally in my work as a minister of a congregation. So organizationally, I think we're a statewide organization, and we're trying to build a broad network of congregations that are supporting public education in the state of North Carolina. And so, like a lot of state organizations, one of our really pressing issues is the Leandro case, which I won't talk. Okay, I figure some nods. You've been doing this for 5 years. I don't need to tell you what the Leandro case is, but Leandro has been a big priority for us. And for the last many, many years, right? It's about almost 30 years at this point. And so we're trying to educate communities about what the issues are in public education. And that's one of the biggest ones where we feel like we have a spot to really advocate from. One of our big initiatives right now is Mission Amplify. This is an advocacy toolkit that our executive director and a few board members helped work on. This is to help congregations to understand what the issues are in public education in North Carolina right now, and to start from the beginning, right? So finding out who your legislators, who are your elected officials. So this is really for congregations who are thinking for the first time about coming to the work of advocacy and don't quite know where to start, or really how that fits in. Diane posed that question so beautifully with their faith commitment. How is this a faith issue? And where do I begin to go from thinking just about the charity support that I offer schools to how I can advocate for public education more widely? So I would encourage you, if you are part of a community that would like to offer something like that, to build some support and some advocacy in your community, and you're not sure how to do that, please visit our website and check out Mission Amplify. It's a completely free toolkit that we've created and we're so excited about. So one overlap, I could have made a Venn diagram here, but I didn't. But so organizational, personal, and then the overlap, right? The overlap for me is in this educational piece. It's really trying to help Christians, I think it's my specific place where I'm coming from, helping people of faith in the Christian tradition to understand what those issues are around public education. And I use the language sometimes of decoding what you're hearing about education, because so many people don't recognize the extent of the dismantling of public education, the attempt to dismantle public education that's happening across our nation and in our state. And so one of the things that's so important is teaching that language of what is really going on when you hear the word school choice or parent choice or freedom or innovation, right? These are like really exciting, wonderful words, but what's really going on behind those words that have to do with, I'm going to use the word sabotaging public education. And the final piece that's been really surprising to me in my ministry as a pastor in an ecumenical congregation of very progressive people is the pastoral support and care work that I have had the opportunity to do with, I think we've heard this phrase in educational equity, nice white parents who see themselves as very progressive and committed to public education. And then they have children and they're not sure where to send them to school. This is not a conversation I've had once or twice. This is a conversation I've had many times with parents who support public education, and then they've sent their kids to school and they're struggling. And then they recognize that they still have this privilege, they still have this hold that whiteness has on them, to say, am I going to opt out of this system? Because maybe it's not what I feel like is best for my kid. And that is hard. Those are hard spiritual, moral questions. And so as a pastor, I often get to sit in that space where people are trying to figure out how they live out their values, the things that they say are important when it comes to their own children and their own communities. All right, on time? Okay. There's my final quote. So I want to say a word about why this is faith work. As a Baptist pastor, why do I do this work that is so political in nature? I don't think that supporting children in schools is something I generally have to convince pastors that is important, or church members is important. A lot of churches do that work. After school programs, food programs, things like that. But as a pastor doing that work in a lot of different settings, I became rather disillusioned with that work when I saw how wide the gaps were getting that we were trying to fill, and realized this work was not going to solve those problems. And so I felt, as a pastor, it's still my job to think wisely about how we try to make the world a better place, how we do the most good for everyone in our neighborhoods. And so I think helping churches think about advocacy is a faith task, actually, right? It's about doing the most good in a wise and just way. So this final quote I'll share from the theologian Cynthia Mo Lobeda is: the pivotal question becomes, how are we to become people who bring into public life the values we treasure in our interpersonal relationships? This is the one that turns over in my head, and I think about how we can just ask more from our elected officials, right? Things that we would never accept in our homes or in our congregations, we accept and in our institutions. And so I think pastors are and faith leaders are committed to this work because we're about prophetic imagination. The world can be better, and we need to think about how those values of compassion and love and justice and fairness can go into the public sphere from the private sphere. Thank you.
Hi, y'all. It is great to be here. It's really, really great to be here. I want to acknowledge my newness to the community and the state. I've got 16 years of experience in Texas. I grew up in Michigan, but to be with you to talk about this important topic is really fantastic. And thank you so much for the invitation from our neighbor. I want to go through and start with the second question first, and just talk about that idea, the Jewish value when it comes to education and when it comes to the idea of public education, right? Because Jewish education has always been a value. We see it in the Bible. We see it here in the book of Deuteronomy, right? That idea of impressing or teaching, right? Teaching values, rules, laws, mitzvot, commandments to our children, right? That's an important piece. The next one, please. But here you have in Pirkei Avot, you have some rabbinic works that go beyond just what we see in the Bible. You have this idea of appoint for yourself a teacher and acquire for yourself a companion and judge all people favorably. And the Hebrew is a little bit confusing, or it can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. One of the best things that one can do is when you find a teacher for yourself, you often acquire for yourself a companion, someone who you can learn from and get support from, and be someone that you even, right? One of the things that so many teachers have said is that while they have a lot to teach, as they teach children in particular, right? How much they learn, right? They learn so much. Teaching goes both ways. And the idea, they even go into notions and understandings of who makes for good teachers and what makes for a good student. One who is bashful does not learn. You have to be willing to ask a question, right? And that idea, it's not that bashful people can't learn, right? However, when you're willing to ask questions, when you're really willing to engage in the material, that is a part of the learning process. And one who is impatient cannot teach. And I would say one who's impatient with your students it makes it a lot harder, right? My brother was a middle school math teacher for a very long time. One of the most impatient people I have ever met. I love him dearly. And if he was here, if he came with you, Dina, I would still say that, right? And he's one of the best teachers, because all of that impatience, when it came to working with his students, it went out the window. And he was able to focus in on those students and really teach. But you see this integral, like our rabbis, we're talking about over 1800 years ago, engaging in what does it mean to be a good student? What does it mean to be a good learner? What does it mean to be a good teacher? Next slide. All right, so this is from the Talmud. Again, rabbinic teachings. So Joshua ben Gamliel comes and he ordains that teachers of young children, this is after a long conversation, teachers of young children should be appointed in each district and each town, and that children should enter school at the age of 6 or 7. All children. This is over 1,500 years ago. 1,500 years ago, what you see throughout Jewish history and throughout Jewish tradition is the value and the importance of education. And one piece that I want to leave up there is the last slide. Just one more teaching. One more teaching. Who is wise? From Ben Zoma. One who learns from all people. As it says, I have acquired understanding from all of my teachers. Right, quoting that verse from scripture. And that's one that I want to leave up there as we think about this idea of equity. Because unfortunately, in the public school system, and my father was an elementary school teacher and then a principal before he passed away when I was young, I come with a real heart and a real understanding and a real appreciation of a public school education. I just want to share a couple of pieces about the inequities that we see. We see inequities and we're trying to address, and we see this within my own family. Not every kid fits that, that mold, right? There's a lot of unique individuals amongst all of our students. And from a mental health standpoint, we're working on trying to provide that sense of equity. And I think that we're doing a lot better than we were, 20 years ago or 50 years ago or more. And that's one real piece. That's a very important piece when it comes to equity for our young people. Another place where we see a lot of challenge and a lot of difficulty is just in Texas, where I was for 16 years in Colleyville, and in North Carolina, from what I've already experienced so far. I don't know if y'all know this, but there's not so many Jews, and there's a lot more Christians. Parents struggle. Jewish parents struggle. And I love, Dina, I love your perspective on this, but we struggle. I've literally had parents come up to me and say, I hate December. Because you've got all these Jewish kids that are not celebrating Christmas. And so much goes into Christmas in the public schools. And that idea that the message that gets sent to a lot of Jewish kids, I don't belong, I don't belong, and I don't belong. And we even had this experience where for our our kindergarten teacher for one of our daughters, we sat down and said, instead of writing a letter to Santa, what if you wrote a letter? And you could write that letter to Santa, or you could write it to a grandparent, or you could, instead of saying, we're going to write a letter to Santa, but Michal, right, you can write a letter to anybody you want because you are different. Even after explaining that, she chose option 2, right? And so there is that understanding of diversity on many different levels, which is important. And then one last piece is that I think that we'll get into other issues, But one of the things that I see as a real challenge for public education is really valuing our teachers. I was on the Grapevine-Colleyville School District's 10-year plan, right? 10-year strategic planning process. There were 30 people in the room, teachers, students. We had maintenance staff. Community leaders, et cetera. And the idea of teacher salary was the conversation. And they wanted to be like the goal, the thought was, we want to be at the top of the scale. And I was like, the scale doesn't work. I said this to a group of all of these people. The scale doesn't work. We are not paying teachers what they deserve. We're not valuing education and the work that our teachers are doing day in, day out. Why don't we blow the scale out of the water and really pay teachers what they deserve? And I was met with silence, absolute silence. And I looked at a teacher, I said, come on, think about all the extra hours, all the extra time that you put in, all of the supplies you have to get for yourself in a pretty wealthy school district as this was. Well, that's not the reason why I'm teaching. Because, I mean, maybe she didn't want to say that in front of the administration, right? What she really felt. But here's the thing is that if we actually paid teachers what they deserve, if we gave them respect that they deserved, then we would be able to attract people, not just who have that heart for it, who are really amazing and really talented and doing the best they can, but also get people who might not just have that emotional tie. And we could really have the best people in this critical role for our society. I'm probably over time, but I want you to know that, I mean, there's so many different ways that we can address this idea of equity within schools. I mean, let's make sure that some schools in the district are not crumbling, right? That everybody can take pride in the building that you're going into. And let's also think about that idea of if every child has a sense of safety, security, physically, emotionally, right? Then they really could be able to do the best they could. So many things that we have to work on. And again, it's just such a honor to be with you to be able to discuss some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Am I allowed to start by answering a question? So Charlie's discussing currently, but to answer your question, Charlie, it is definitely the same for Muslim families, Muslim children. Talk about during Ramadan fasting, not being able to go to the cafeteria. There's a lot of similarities. And what you touched on segues really nicely into what I'm about to talk about. So thank you. And thank you, Diane, for that lovely introduction. And just it's a privilege and honor being with you all today. So I am going to start talking professionally first, and then I will jump into my role just in my faith, what education is in my faith to me. I'm currently a technical assistant specialist and DEIJ, which is Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Coordinator at ONLAR, which is an education management consulting firm. And we focus on early childhood, higher education, family engagement, leadership development, special education, and so much more. But I'd like to highlight two projects in particular that really tie nicely into what we were discussing today. One project that we're working on focuses on belonging in the school systems. So what we do is we create content, we create learning modules for educators. And in addition to that, action planning resources so that they then take that content and actually, run with it and make some policies. But the learning modules are for educators to explore their own biases and to develop strategies to manage them. And that could be independently, but also within their own school community. And some of the themes with those learning modules are around professional learning, relationship building, cultural competency, and humility. wellness, and identity affirmation. Another project that I'd like to highlight that we're currently working on, and I would like to note that both of these are pilots and we're hoping to hopefully expand them, but it's focusing on mentoring beginning educators of color. And this is because one of the challenges that I see are, and what we've noticed in our work, and of course, I'm sure what you all have noticed, is retention, especially for educators of color, and also representation. Students aren't seeing their teachers represented in the way that they look. And the goal is to really create a more diverse workforce. So how do we do this? We create a mentorship program for teachers who have, more experience, are later on in their career and able to really support beginning educators of color who really do need that support to develop their careers. And what we've learned is that teachers and professionals in general just really need a space to talk, to really know that they are not alone in what they're going through. Now, whether that is microaggressions, just different complicated issues with administration, whatever it may be, they want to know that they're not alone. They want to know that there are others who are going through the same thing and that they have support where it's needed. So it's really been a privilege to be a part of both of these projects. So I really wanted to highlight those because they show the challenges that we're facing. But another layer of this challenge is, and this is what we're trying to tackle first, is a sense of belonging. We want the students to be able to feel a sense of belonging in the schools, again, retention and representation, to really reach that point of equity. But there's also people who are opposing this work. So I'll give you a story. We were going in person for one of these projects to do an in-person training. And some of our colleagues were actually nervous because there was a group in the state that we were working in that were opposing these types of programs. They actually submitted a request for all the public records, which of course has all the names of everyone involved. And so they were worried that they would be met with opposition. And that could look a lot of different ways, in the US, we know, with gun violence, whatever it may be. But that's what we were nervous and, approaching this kind of work. And so added on to all of these challenges, you still have people who don't see the impact of this work, don't understand how beneficial it is, and are still opposing it. So that's another added layer and challenge. And I would like to note that after Googling some of these members of this group, they are members of prestigious universities. So you're going to find opposition with all walks of life. But I would like to add that even though there are a lot of challenges, it's also a lot of really great work and a lot of impact, and we can see the real changes that are happening. So along the lines of seeking equity in education for all children is and why it's important in Islam. This is what you see on the screen here. And I'd like to give a shout out to my dad, who said, when I was writing and trying to think of what to talk about, he said, think about the first word that was revealed to the Prophet, Prophet Muhammad, which is the Muslim prophet, peace be upon him. And that is Iqra, and that is the Arabic word up there. So in fact, that is the first word revealed to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And what this word means is read or recite. So this really shows the significance of this word, and it can be understood in different ways. And that's threefold, which I'm about to explain. One is the importance of seeking knowledge and education in Islam. And two, the revelation began with the command read. So it really indicates the value of acquiring knowledge and importance of literacy within Islam. And in fact, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, emphasized the importance of seeking knowledge, and it's considered a religious obligation for all Muslims to become educated. I also would like to note, which I didn't note in the beginning, I am not a religious leader, so just putting that out there. But secondly, the word Iqra can also be interpreted as a call to action. The Quran, which is the religious book, isn't just a book to be read, but a guide for how we should live our lives and act on its teachings. The word Iqra really serves as a reminder for Muslims to not only read and recite the Quran, but to also put its teachings into practice. And lastly, the word Iqra also symbolizes the divine revelation and the role of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as the messenger of God. And the first revelation really began with the command, read in the name of your Lord who created, which emphasizes that divine source of the Quran and the role of the Prophet. So now that we know the importance of education in Islam, what about equity in education? Islam really does promote educational equity by providing equal opportunities for education to all individuals. The Quran says, "O mankind, we have created you from a male and female and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another. Verily, the most honorable of you with Allah or God is that believer who is the most righteous." So what do I mean by this? All individuals, regardless of race, ethnicity, background, are all equal in the eyes of God. And therefore, all educational opportunities should be inclusive and accessible to all, regardless of social status, economic background, race, whatever it may be. One common misconception, which I love to bring up, is about women in Islam not being able to get an education. So I'm going to use me as an example, and this is not to just list out my accomplishments, but it is a way for me to say go Heels, first of all, because I did go to UNC Chapel Hill for undergrad, and then I did go to NC State for my master's, and hopefully potentially in the future maybe a PhD. So that's just showing you that women in Islam really, are on the forefront of getting educated. And whatever you see, it's really important to differentiate the difference between religion and culture. That's an issue that I've been seeing pretty widely, where somebody sees a certain country doing something in a certain way, and they assume that because there are people with that religion in that country, that the religion is dictating this. So it's really actually very dangerous to not differentiate between culture and religion. Islam also emphasizes the importance of education for the betterment of society. So spreading the message of Islam by acquiring knowledge and really learning what it is that the teachings are. Education is a means to promote social justice and to help individuals better understand and appreciate diversity of different people and cultures around them. So I'd like to end with a quote. I think the quote is next somewhere. Here we go. By Desmond Tutu. He said, "Inclusive, good quality education is a foundation for dynamic and equitable societies." So this quote really speaks to me in a lot of different ways. But mainly, I just want to add that we can all do this work. It's not just, for people who are in specific fields. We really are all equipped to do this, and we have to support each other to do it. And by bringing us together, thank you, Diane, I think we're starting in the right direction. So thank you.
Last is worse than first, Rebecca. But thank you so much, fellow panelists. Thank you, Knollwood. I am so inspired by this work, by this ongoing conversation, by something called Faith in the City, Faith in the Polis, something that acknowledges that our faith has a public dimension. So thank you so much. Grateful to the pastors and members of this church that are friends of mine, and especially to Dr. Diane Lipset, host today, but also friend and professor of mine, and a model of how the very best of faithful learning flows out into meaningful and redemptive action. So thank you, Diane, for the invitation today. That action is, of course, rooted in the commitment to justice that is so core to my faith. Justice, which Dr. Cornell West has said, is what love looks like in public. We as Christians inherit this from Judaism. Justice is what the God of Israel causes to roll down. It's what Yahweh requires of us, to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God. Walter Brueggemann, the scholar of the Hebrew Bible, has defined biblical justice this way. He says, biblical justice means finding out what belongs to whom and then returning it to them. Finding out what belongs to whom and then doing the work necessary to make sure they have it, to return it to them, because it probably has been taken from them. This is a commitment core to the life and ministry of Jesus, who put his whole life into it. This insistence that the world could be what it ought to be, what it was created to be by God. We as Christians have just passed through the season where we remember Jesus's death and his refusal for death to have the last word. But we know that death did not come for spiritual reasons. It came executed by the Roman Empire because Jesus insisted on another way, a way he called the kingdom or realm of God. And he put his life into that, finding his way always to marginalized, isolated, ostracized people in need, people including children. Now, when Jesus says, let the children come to me, sometimes I think we imagine these adorable scenes, almost like Jesus is having a little children's sermon or something. We should remember, however, that the definitive characteristic of children in the ancient world was not that they were adorable or energetic or imaginative. No, the New Testament scholar Bruce Metzger has said that the salient feature of children in the ancient world is that they were extraordinarily vulnerable, which is to say, they were like the children that we know and love today. I know this first as a father of 4 children, Jack and Della and Warner and Bee, who my wife Jenny and I have raised to hopefully live out these commitments of justice, and have utilized every resource that we have around us, and have certainly found such value in having our children deeply involved in our public schools in Guilford County. My wife, Jenny, has also been involved. She is a 2-term PTA president. Those were COVID years, so extra credit for those. And I quickly, as someone who wanted to be involved in the places and spaces where my children were, became involved as well in the public school life. At our elementary school, Irving Park Elementary, I became the orientation speaker when we were trying to recruit some of those nice white parents that Rebecca talked about, and convince them that their neighborhood school, their zone school, was the school they should send their kids to, because, of course, they have a choice. Well, my children have inherited some of this pride and belief in public schools. And in fact, once my oldest, Jack, started in kindergarten, when we would drive by our neighborhood school, our home school, Irving Park Elementary, he would say, "Hey, there's my school." And I watched how that began to become a familiar refrain in our minivan. The kids would say, "Well, there's our school," every time we drove by Irving Park. That kind of pride and involvement and belief is core to my sense and experience of the schools, that they are these laboratories of our highest ideals, that they are where we fulfill our commitment to every single child, that they are a measure of our democracy. In fact, Marian Wright Edelman has said, the test of morality, of a society's morality, is what we do for our children. And there is so much work to do around this. I am certainly learning in my new role now, 4 or 5 months in on the Guilford County Board of Education, how much of that work is about prioritizing and sorting through how to give the best energy to the most urgent things. But as I think about those things that remain priorities for me, they are much of what first motivated me and inspired me to invest in our schools. And first of all, it is a commitment to equity, especially racial equity. The greatest factor impacting educational outcomes remains race, nothing else. Race is the most significant factor impacting educational outcomes. We must continue to work for equity, continue to name the dynamics that lead to inequity, and speak against those so that we can imagine another way forward. Second priority for me is the diversity that has already been referenced today. I so appreciate Dina and Rabbi Charlie, who have reminded us of the importance of interfaith diversity, of what we Baptists know, that there should be no religious priority given in any public space. But for me, that also extends most critically now to affirmation and inclusion of our LGBTQ students and teachers, because our schools have become this cultural battleground, have become the front lines for battles that can't be won on larger stages. And so these battles have come to our schools. We have seen this in the form of bills that are arising, including in our own state legislature. And these bills that limit what a teacher can teach or what a child can know or express, they do absolutely nothing to determine a child's sexuality. But they do quite a lot to impact whether or not that child might be a victim of bullying or harm from others, or even from themselves. And so I am committed to diversity and believe our schools should be a place where that is ensured. And then finally, I think bedrock for all of this and all that we want to accomplish in our schools is a commitment to make sure our schools are funded at the maximum level possible. Our schools are not underperforming. They are underfunded. North Carolina state budget right now is actively considering what would be a significant decrease for our public schools and an increase in school vouchers. I like Rebecca's term sabotage to describe this. And I believe I saw this throughout the campaign season that I experienced from about this time until November, about this time last year until November of 2022. My opponent ran on a platform called Take Back Our Schools. I always get a little nervous when people talk about going backwards, don't you? She was probably the most extreme person on the Guilford County ballot, a relative of Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, who was recruited to run on an extremist platform, that is absolutely a deliberate attempt to erode trust in our public schools. And so I leave you with a quote that inspires me, but for negative reasons, and that is from Christopher Rufo. Christopher Rufo, you may know, is the author of the anti-CRT efforts, and he has said that universal school choice, or the privatization of education, it rests on a premise of universal school distrust. There is a deliberate effort to establish that, and it's an effort that sees danger at every turn. It's an effort that creates division between educators and the trusted adults in students' lives. It's an effort that is undermining our schools in so many ways. And we, people of faith, can't let that happen, because, to quote the Sherouse kids, those are our schools. Thank you.
I can speak for the group in expressing gratitude for how thought-provoking and incisive his opening remarks were. We do have some time for a conversation, and I'd like to begin by asking our panelists, is there anything you already did to some degree, talk to each other and talk in relation to each other in your opening remarks? Is there something that you were left with? Rebecca went first. She didn't have a chance to do that. Would any of you like to answer something another panelist raised, or underscore a remark another panelist made?
Well, if I could, I'd love to get Rebecca and Dina's perspective on what Alan just left us with, right? With that idea of distrust. Because when we're talking about getting faith leaders together throughout the state to support our public school system, when we're talking about making sure that our educators, right, are able to work on their own biases in spite of, right, the attacks from the outside, are there things that y'all are seeing that point to a way forward, especially with the distrust that people are trying to instill in our public school system?
Does my voice reach over here? Okay, that's a great question. And I would say, as simple as this sounds, dialogue is really a huge way to bridge that connect and dispel all of the distrust, bring people together. I've seen that a lot of this negativity that we see, any issues that arise, really are because of ignorance and misconceptions and just a lack of understanding. Once we help them, understand the reality of the situation and what's going on, and really bring people together to have these discussions like we're having now, that really does ease that distrust.
Yeah. I think another thing I'm thinking about is that when we're coming at education advocacy, we really need to think about the way we talk about our teachers, and always reminding myself that our teachers are being given an impossible job. And so trying to figure out what is the place where we distrust or trust, and to trust, I trust very deeply that most of our teachers are doing the absolute best they can with a really, really difficult job that just gets harder and harder. And so it's not a lack, for me, a lack of trust in teachers. It's a clear, for me, it's a lack of trust in some decision making that's happening much higher than teachers. But I think that that the sort of the movement to distrust our schools is coming from not from a good faith place, but coming from a place of encouraging us to distrust teachers, and to distrust the people. I like the way you said, Alan, kind of putting parents and teachers like in a combative nature as opposed to any kind of trust there. And the point is to think that public education is failing so that we can do it a different way. And the different way that it can be done is a way that would make money for a lot of people. And I think that that's an important thing to recognize. And so the distrust is encouraged in a really negative and unhelpful direction, I think.
I would like to add also, and unfortunately, sorry, Alan, my back is to you, but teachers are not given a seat at the table. So these decisions are happening without teachers at the table. And that's the stem of a lot of these problems.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. Questions and comments from our audience. So much to interact with. Dean.
I remember seeing a column that said something very interesting, which is that the founders of the various religions of the world, if they came back today, might not recognize their own religion, whether it would be Jesus or Muhammad or Moses or David or whomever. And I think today your topic and your statements have reminded me that many of the attacks, unfortunately, against public education are coming out of different conservative religious circles. And that's one of the reasons we need to learn how to use not only our best knowledge and information, but words of faith to counter that. So I'd love to hear more comments. We always like for the audience to leave with some things to do or think about or actions to take. What should we as ordinary individuals, the people of faith, most boned up on to be ready to speak to the issues from a position of not only government from citizens, but also people of faith?
Sometimes I try and repeat questions back for the sake of our online participants, but I think the nature of this question will be clear in its answers.
Wants to start.
I'm happy to start. I recently watched a TED Talk by Lovey, and I can't remember her last name, but she calls herself a professional troublemaker, which I love. And the talk was about being comfortable, being uncomfortable, basically. So I think that's one huge action step. A lot of times when people are seeing inequities, something that's happening that you know is incorrect, you're not comfortable saying something. You're not comfortable taking that step and having a conversation. I think that's the first step in actually making changes. It's being advocates for each other. Whenever you see an injustice, you have to say something. Otherwise, it's going to continue happening.
And along those lines, if I can actually follow up, that idea of supporting people that are not like you, right? And really being those allies to each other is very, very important. Another way of addressing these issues is to, from my perspective, we need to be talking to everybody. This is our public education system. And so if there's somebody who's really extreme, well, that's the person that I need to be able to talk to and develop a relationship with. And let's get at the roots, right? Because our ideas, right? Everybody's ideas come from someplace. And so to try to figure out where that understanding is and to have that sense of curiosity. And if we're not going to get consensus on everything, right? We have to understand and we have to appreciate that, and the Talmud teaches this, but I think we know this, which is that we are going to disagree, right? Rebecca and I might agree on 95%, but we're going to disagree on certain pieces. I mean, I think Dina is amazing and we disagree on stuff, right? We've been married for over 20 plus years. And so disagreement is natural. Let's not expect everybody's going to think the way that I do. And so when we reach out to somebody, we want to at least create that sense of understanding. And then the last piece of it is that if they are absolutely opposed to the idea, if someone's opposed to the idea of public education, if they really want, right, like that last quote was so powerful, right, to really sow those seeds of distrust and mistrust, I'm not going to personally attack that person, but I do want to make sure that we address those issues and talk about all of the reasons why we need to and we can have faith in our public school system, in our school administrators, in our teachers. It's not that people don't make mistakes. It's not that there aren't bad moments, right? And when you have to be on with a group of kids all the time, and kids are unexpected, do the unexpected and ask the unexpected, let's have a little bit of compassion around that. Let's have a little bit of grace around that. And that notion, though, that idea that for those people who are on the fence, right, we really need to be able to talk to those people and really address them and show them that the reasons why our faith and our society, right, really points us towards that direction of supporting education for all of our children.
Yeah. Well, I would say you are doing it in many powerful ways already, just to understand the public aspects of our faith, to recognize that it is important to partner with a local school. It's important to tutor. It's important to be a lunch buddy, to support teachers and do a teacher appreciation breakfast. Those are all powerful, needed things, and yet they are charitable actions that in and of themselves don't change a system. And so you're doing the work to think about how can we be about that higher, more holistic work of justice, that wholesale effort to really try to change the system for everyone. And I think especially in faith communities, we have to seek to do both. But in Christian faith communities, I think we have a particular responsibility to show the ways in which we do this, not in spite of our faith, but because of our faith, how our faith leads to this commitment to this public good of education, because so much of what is eroding it is coming from Christian voices. And so I think providing an alternative and clear and coherent witness to why our faith compels us towards this kind of public redemptive action is an especially important responsibility for those of us seeking to follow in the way of Jesus.
Alan, you set me up to plug this program again. Thank you. I'm going to do that. So this Mission Amplify program that I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation is something that Pastors for North Carolina Children is trying to offer completely free to communities who are trying to figure out how to do this work. And so I would offer that, and I'm sure there are other things too, but I would offer that as like a step that if it's hard to know like what the first step of doing education advocacy was, and most of y'all are many steps down the line here. But if you wanted to share that with people, it's really about looking at what are the major areas in North Carolina right now that need more support in our education system, using faith language to talk about how we should respond to those out of the particularly the Christian scriptures, and then encouraging small acts of advocacy. So writing, calling your legislators, and then there are, as you move along, there are ways that sort of push you a little bit further, like out of your comfort zone maybe. And so that's a real, I would guess I'd say a real practical way to say like, this is some work we can do. And the more of us that do that, the better.
So more than 1,500 years ago, Jewish sages, we have learned, said those vulnerable children should be going to school when they're 5 or 6. And not very long after, the first word revealed to the prophet was read or recite. And we are challenged today to take public redemptive action as an expression of our faith. And there are practical tools, a Google search away, to help direct us. We have learned so much and been challenged in so many ways that it's hard to end the conversation, but the time does run out. And in the last 30 seconds, I'm going to invite Dean to come and say what's up in May for Faith in the City.
And even before I do that, I'm very aware that right now, to get engaged in the budget discussion at the state level, because even Medicaid expansion is being tied to whether the budget will be approved or not. And that budget that's been proposed includes a lot of increases for education, and we need to make our voices heard or it will be endangered. Next month, I've forgotten which one of you said something about schools being a cultural battleground, and definitely they are. And one example of the sabotage and the use of something that sounds good to often sow distrust in our schools is the term parents' rights. And so our last session in May, before we break for the summer, is going to look at the issue of what does it really mean to talk about parent rights? I think we can all agree that there is a need for a genuine partnership between school and home. What does that look like? What are the relative roles and contributions that come from each direction? How can those be forged into a relationship of trust and partnership rather than being used to undermine what goes on in our schools, which is often what is being suggested under the title Parents' Rights. So we're going to have a parent who is going to speak from that perspective on our panel. We're going to have a teacher. They will be sharing their experiences, their strategies, their ideas and dreams for what parent rights and genuine partnership looks like. And we will also hear from Tricia McManus, our school superintendent, who will address some of the things that the school system is currently trying to do to already begin forging a deeper partnership between school and home. I think it's going to be an interesting dialogue and a chance again for you to get in the middle of what is or can be often presented as a contentious issue. So I invite you to come first Tuesday in May at noon. Join us for our last session for this year. Thank you for being here.
And from May back to April, will you help us once more thank this remarkable panel?